Welcome to our AM service. We're glad you are here. We are continuing our Creation and Covenant series. Today, our message title is God Himself Will Provide. God Himself will provide out of Genesis 22. So we have quite a few slides to read out loud together. So we're going to take turns. You guys will start, then I will go. We'll take turns. It's 6 slides total, okay? So everyone stand up, and we're going to read the word of the Lord out loud together today. This one starts with all of us together, and then it'll be me, and then all of us, and then me, and then all of us, and then all together at the end, okay? Genesis 21. Here we go. Ready all together? Ready? Begin. Sometime later, God tested Abraham's faith. Abraham, God called. Yes, he replied. Here I am. Take your son, your only son, yes, Isaac, whom you love so much, and go to the land of Moriah. Go and sacrifice him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains, which I will show you. The next morning, Abraham got up early and set out for the place God had told him about. On the 3rd day of their journey, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Stay here with the donkey, Abraham told the servants. The boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and we will come right back. Okay, read together the next slide. 1, 2, 3, begin. So Abraham placed the wood for the burnt offering on Isaac's shoulders, while he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them walked on together, Isaac turned to Abraham and said, Father. Yes, my son, Abraham replied. We have the fire and the wood, the boy said, but where is the sheep for the burnt offering? God will provide a sheep for the burnt offering, my son, Abraham answered, and they both walked on together. When they arrived at the place where God had told him to go, Abraham built an altar and arranged the wood on it. Then he tied his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham picked up the knife to kill his son as a sacrifice. At that moment, the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Yes, Abraham replied, here I am. Do not lay a hand on the boy, the angel said. Do not hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. All together, ready? Begin. Then Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham named the place Yahweh Yireh, which means the Lord will provide. All together, ready? Begin. Then the angel of the Lord called again to Abraham from heaven. This is what the Lord says, because you have obeyed me and have not withheld even your son, your only son, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. And through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed, all because you have obeyed me. This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So let's just jump into it because what is going on in this story? There's a lot going on here, okay? So let's do a quick refresher. Up until this point, God called Abraham at the ripe old age of 75 years old. And God told him, leave your father's household, go to the land I will show you, because I will promise you so many descendants, as numerous as the stars, and you will have the land, your descendants will have the land, and you will be a blessing to all nations. So that was the promise that God gave him. And Abraham believed and went. But here was the problem. They were old and infertile, no children. And so for 25 years, they wrestled with God's promise and saw nothing happen for 25 years. But in God's perfect timing, in 25 years, God provided Abraham and Sarah the son that God promised. His name was Isaac. Isaac means laughter and joy. Because when God told him a year before he was born that Isaac was going to be his son, they both laughed. They're like, yeah, I don't know if you know God, but we cannot have kids. And then Isaac was born. This is really important context. Remember, Abraham already had a son through Hagar, Sarah's servant, Ishmael. This was their own way of trying to make God's promise happen, but it did not work. It only caused strife in the family. Isaac was the son that God had promised. And so this is really, really important context for today. Isaac was the son through whom God would one day provide many descendants. So here we are today. We don't know exactly how old Isaac was, but he was old enough to carry wood and still young enough to be called a boy, not a man, okay? So he's probably somewhere in his teenage years. Okay, teenage boy, this is Isaac right now. And so that's the context for today. And Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac was born. So whatever age Isaac is at, whether he's 13, 15, 17, somewhere in that window, Abraham is 113 or 115. Okay, so he's an old man. And here's Isaac in his youth walking alongside his dad. So here we have in verse 1, about, 15 plus years have passed at this point. God decides to test Abraham's faith again. Now, that question has to be asked. Why would God test Abraham? Like, he's waited 25 years for this son, and he's gone up and down in his faith. He's trusted God, not trusted God, made some major mistakes, trusted God again. He's already gone through the ringer, this guy. But God decides to test Abraham's faith again. Why do you think that is? Is it because God's bored? He's got nothing better to do? Here's the thing. Biblical faith is this. Biblical faith is resting and trusting in God alone. How many of you can truly do that right now? Believe and trust in something other than yourself. That's very hard for us to do. That's why children are so good at this, because this is their life, is to trust and rest on somebody else. And yet that's the kind of faith God calls us to. Oftentimes throughout Abraham's journey too, he trusted in himself multiple times and made many, many mistakes. He almost lost Sarah to Pharaoh in Egypt. The whole Ishmael debacle. Like, there were so many things that Abraham did. Even though he knew in his head to trust God, he's relying on his own strength, right? And that process of God teaching Abraham how to surrender, how to trust, this is a lifelong process. Lifelong process. But here we are at the greatest test of Abraham's life. And here's our main point today. And it's this. The testing of our faith will require sacrifice. The two, faith and sacrifice, are actually very intricately connected. Another important context for us to know, remember, what's the most important thing when we're reading the Bible? What's the most important thing? You all know. Context, okay? I say it every single week. The most important thing to know in the Bible is context, okay? So historically, what's going on? Abraham lived in a time in the ancient Near East where it's a pagan culture all around him. So at that time, it was very, very normal, does not mean okay, but normal, that in order to appease the gods of those cultures of that time, they would often sacrifice their children to the gods for like that next year's harvest or food or whatever, right? So that was the cultural context of that time. So if you're a pagan person living in that time and you overhear and eavesdrop Abraham's conversation with God, this does not seem that crazy compared to our Western world, okay? Now, we will see later in Scripture, obviously you guys read it, that God stopped Abraham from actually killing Isaac. And all throughout the Old Testament, we see over and over again that God says the sin he hates the most is sacrificing children. That's the one he hates the most. And he tells the Israelites, you will be different than your neighbors. You will not do what they do. You will not sacrifice your children. Children are a gift and a blessing from the Lord. So it's a very different thing that God is doing. So this is actually less about Isaac and sacrifice, and this is actually more about Abraham and faith. Okay? So here we see in verse 3, if we keep going, God tells him to sacrifice his son. How does it make sense? This is the son that Abraham waited 25 years for, received sign after covenant, after confirmation that this would be the son. And now God is asking him to kill him? How does it make any sense? Do you think Abraham got any sleep that night? Probably not. Do you know why I think he went out early in the morning? Yes, he was being obedient, but it's because he could not probably sleep. So he was like, I'm already awake. We might as well get a head start on the journey. And so he leaves immediately and goes exactly to the place God told him. Do you think Abraham remembered 35, 40 years earlier when he heard God's voice for the first time and set out for the place that God would tell him to go? Do you think he remembered that? I'm pretty sure he did. He's like, oh, this feels like deja vu. You know, God told me to go, and here I am going to do this impossible thing. And yet here next to me is my son, the one that God promised, that 40 years ago I never thought I would have. And yet he's here right now. Look at what Abraham says to his servant. Every single word in the Bible is so critical. Every word. And here's the one 2-letter word that's so critical in this passage. He told his servants, the boy and I will travel a little further. We will worship there, and then we will come right back. That we will come right back is the most important, groundbreaking, faith evidence thing we see in this passage. Remember, God told him, go sacrifice your son. What does he mean that they're going to come back? Is he going to pretend to sacrifice him and not? No. We see later in Hebrews 11, it says that Abraham in his mind was like, this makes no sense. But God is not crazy, and I'm going to obey. So this is what this means. That even if I follow exactly what God says and I sacrifice him, God told me this is the promised son. He cannot go back on that. So I'm going to believe that God will bring the boy back from the dead, and we will come back down. That's what Abraham reasoned. He was like, how can these two opposite things make sense? They don't. So the only way is that God's going to bring him to life because he will do what he said he will do, and I will obey. So the only way is that kind of miracle. That we will come right back. That shows Abraham's faith. Now here's the thing. We cannot forget that this is Abraham's greatest test of faith in his life. We're like, whoa, he's so cool. How could he have that kind of faith? Actually, we have to remember that before this big test of faith came many, many, many times over the years of small tests and trials of faith. When he was able to succeed in this, it was because of all the times he failed and also grew in his faith in the smaller testings. So let me ask you right now, do you feel like you're in a season of testing and your testing feels big right now? If your season of testing right now in your life feels big, I want you to remember the many, many smaller ways that God tested your faith to bring you to where you are right now. God does not give you the SAT right away. God gives you so many smaller things all along the way to prepare you for the greater test. Why? Does he just love tests? No. Why does God test our faith? Because actually, when our faith gets tested, what that reveals is more of God's character. I'm going to say it again. That's really important, okay? What testing does, yes, it grows our faith, but why God tests our faith is for us to personally experience and understand more of God's character, more of who he is. So this test is actually less about you, and it's more about God revealing his character in such a way that it will be ingrained in your psyche, in your life, in your history, in your story, because you experienced it. How many of you are the type of person? I have 2 children, correct? Okay? One of my children, you shall guess which one it is a type that if I tell him or her, don't do this, he's like, okay, I won't do it. The other child, I'll be like, don't do it. And that child is like, I'm going to do it. And I already see it from a very young age, okay? So you know the person that like, if someone's like, just don't do the hard thing, they're like, oh, okay, that's good. But then there's the rest of you who are like, I'm going to do it myself. And then turns out your parent was right, but you're too stubborn to admit that they were correct, okay? The point being, God knows that most of us are like the second child, okay? Most of us, we got to figure it out on our own. And God's like, okay, I'm going to use that then, but I'm going to use it to reveal my character to you in a way that you cannot deny. So when we're like, nuh-uh, God, this is not what I signed up for. And God's like, you said you're going to do it. So while you go off and do that hard thing, I'm going to show you my character through it and who I am. So whenever you go through a season of testing, two things. Remember all the smaller tests all throughout your life that God has brought you through. Because that is what sustains you. And number two, testing is actually to reveal God's character. So when you're in testing, you got to ask yourself, what is God trying to show me about him? Less about, oh my gosh, my world's falling apart, which that's true too. But the more important takeaway is, what is God showing me about his character through this testing? Because that's what he wants us to learn. So here we are in verse 6. Now it's just Abraham and Isaac. No one else is there. He places the wood on Isaac's shoulders. And here's Isaac, okay? Isaac is a smart boy. He is not D-U-M-B, right? Because I got children in here. He is smart. And he is like, Father, we got wood, we got fire, we got a knife, we got no animal. Did you forget one? What's going on? And what does Abraham say? God will provide. God will provide. Abraham does not know how God will provide. But this is the bottom line, that God will provide. Here we see that Abraham falls back on the character of God. Abraham could have been like, yo, son, I don't get it either. But he's like, kill you. And he's like, whoa, he could have said anything. But Abraham's like, you know what? God will provide. When God's plan does not make any sense, that's when we fall back on God's character the most. You know, when you have a friend that you like love so much, and you, or like a significant other or whatever, or a parent that you love, and sometimes what they say or do does not make sense, and you're like, I'm not sure what you're thinking. But if you know that person's character, if you know that person, who they are, and you trust them, then you trust them, even if it doesn't make sense. How much more so with God? The bottom line here is, when we are in a place where it's hard to trust God, our fallback, our safety net is always God's character. Always. Who is God? Who is God? When things don't make sense, human reasoning, no matter how smart you are, who thinks you are the smartest human being in this room right now? Raise your hand. Okay, I knew it would be Sam. Okay? If you are the smartest person in this room, I will ask your wife if that's true. First, just kidding. But the point being, you can be the smartest person in this room, but your human reasoning will fail against God at some point. And when your human reasoning fails, that's when God's like, bingo. Here we go. Buckle up. That's when we're going to learn how to, like, faith. That's when we're going to learn true faith. When things don't make sense, we fall back on what? On God's character. And if you don't know God's character, then welcome, because he's going to lead you through some small trials to show you his character. Here I am in verse 9. They get there. Abraham builds an altar. This is not like a 30-second endeavor. This takes a lot of time. Okay, he's building the altar, arranging the wood, tying his son. This is 100-plus-year-old man tying up a teenage boy. Do you think Isaac fought him? We don't know exactly for sure, but based on what we can read in this passage, we don't think so. Why? Because Isaac trusted his father. Isaac trusted his father. And so here we have, literally picked up the knife to kill his son. And the Lord steps in. An angel calls out and says, "Do not lay a hand. Now I know that you truly fear God." So all along, the plan was never to kill Isaac. Never. This was less about Isaac, and this was more about testing Abraham's faith to reveal God's character. Will Abraham trust in himself when the greatest thing he loves is on the line? The same thing applies to us. When we find ourselves in a rough season, when it feels like God is testing us, when it feels like God is asking us to sacrifice something big, remember this. It is actually less about the sacrifice itself and more about God testing our faith and God revealing his character. This next passage is really important, verse 13. Then Abram looked up and saw a ram caught by its horns in a thicket. So he took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Here we see another foreshadowing of Jesus long before Jesus arrived on the scene. This is where the story really gets me. Here's the thing. What God forbid an earthly father to do, because he knows. Do you think God does not understand what it feels like to sacrifice his son? Actually, God is the one who understands this more than anybody else. What God forbid an earthly father to do, knowing how much that would break an earthly father's heart, God was willing to do himself. To send his son to die for us so that we could have life. Now, what does this tell you about God's character? God will never have us do anything that he himself has not done first, because he gave up the greatest person he loved, the greatest one he loved, for us. What God forbid an earthly father to do, he would one day do. He did for you and I. In this last passage we see, the angel of the Lord confirms once again, "Because you obeyed me, I swear by my own name that I will certainly bless you. Descendants, land, all the things, I will certainly do it." Why? Because you have obeyed me. The cost of not obeying and the reward for obeying is so vast, that gap. Obedience is that powerful and that important. Everyone who came after Abraham benefited because of whose obedience? Abraham's obedience. Now, what about you? Ask yourself right now, sitting right here. In your life, in November of 2024, what are you going through right now in your life? Are you in a season where God seems to be taking everything away? Maybe God is asking a lot of you right now. Maybe God is putting you through many trials. Maybe not. If you're not, one day God will. So at some point, you will go through more than one season of trial. In this season, in this testing, I invite you to remember. Remember all the ways that have led you to this point right now. All the testing, all the small trials that God has brought you through. And what has he taught you about his character? What has he taught you about his character? Because that is your fallback. That is our safety net. Less about the sacrifice, less about all of those things. It's actually more about who is God and why is he showing me this? There is something about God's character that he wants you to intimately understand that you cannot learn any other way. And so that's why in James it says, take joy when trials come. Because when trials come, your faith will grow. And when your faith grows, you'll be stronger, you can persevere, you can endure, and you can truly understand who God is. So today, as we sing this last song, I'm going to invite the praise team to come up. I want us to remember that ultimately the greatest sacrifice God wants of all of us is our very own lives. That we would give our lives to know him, to love him, to obey him, to seek him. When the trial gets too hard, may we not forget that the greatest sacrifice God would not let any of us do, but he himself did, to sacrifice his son so that we could be with him. Can we all stand? For a lot of us in the room, we've grown up in church, so we've heard this over and over again. But today, I want to invite you to come before the altar of God again. In your heart, in your mind, whatever it is that you're wrestling with, come before God again and say, God, I lay it all down. I lay down my burdens. I lay down everything I love, my family, my children, my future, my career, whatever it may be for you. Trusting that God will not take it away, but that God will refine our love so that we could love him the most. And so today, as we sing this song, remember the greatest sacrifice he made. Let us come before him with a heart of worship. Sing together.